In our last episode of Lest We Forget, we saw how the pioneers used spiritual songs to convey important messages. We learn the story of a small church in Washington, New Hampshire, and its minister, Frederick Wheeler, and how he was convicted by a woman, Rachel Oakes, and his own Bible study to keep the Sabbath holy. In today's episode, we will see how that decision affected the local community and then the broader world, making a huge impact on the Adventist movement.
You can never tell what the effects of taking a stand for truth may be. Sometimes it may seem like very little happens, but God can take one small act of faithfulness and use it to change the course of history. In today's episode, the stone of truth that Rachel Oakes dropped into the Millerite pond sends ripples outward to people far from the Washington church.
Now the Sabbath begins to be discussed here in this congregation. The Sabbath is going to be divisive in the Millerite movement. As I mentioned, a few people are going to keep it. But shortly after the disappointment in 1844, shortly after the disappointment, a large man stands up in this congregation. Here's a picture of him, William Farnsworth. He's a farmer. He is one of the leaders in this congregation. And he announced that from thenceforth, he and his family were going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. This was apparently just after the disappointment. So Sabbath begins to be agitated a little bit earlier in 44, then the disappointment in October, and a little agitation among Millerites in general. And now, after the disappointment, Farnsworth stands up. Now, when he says that he and his family were going to, from henceforth, keep the Sabbath, he spoke for a sizable portion of this congregation. Well, maybe not right then, but eventually, because you've got some pictures here. He was the father of 22 children. He had 11 by his first wife. She died, and he marries this woman, and he has 11 more children, total of 22 children. And the majority, not all of them, majority of them grew up to be Seventh-day Adventists. Several of them ministers, Bible workers, lay people, lay leaders in churches. As I say, not all, but most of them did. Well, anyway, he stood up. William Farnsworth stood up. The story is that the following week, his brother stood up and said, I'm going to join my brother, and we're going to be, my family, we're going to be Sabbath-keepers also. Now, Cyrus did not think that he had to repopulate the entire earth. So he only had, I think, 3 or 4 children, not as many. The parents of Cyrus and William Farnsworth, Daniel and Patty Farnsworth, they also accepted the Sabbath. I've not found a picture of Patty, but here is the father, Daniel Farnsworth. So the Farnsworth family and a few others now start keeping the Sabbath in this church. Oh, I should mention also that Rachel Delight Oakes was rooming in the home of Cyrus Farnsworth, the younger brother, and she marries. He marries the school teacher. So now you have Rachel Delight is married to Cyrus Farnsworth.
After the Wheeler and Farnsworth families accepted the Sabbath truth, it began to reach other religious leaders. Thomas Preble was one of these. This man was a Baptist pastor who also became a Millerite. He was the first Millerite to write about the Sabbath as a holy day and disseminate these truths in published form.
Now, how did Preble get the Sabbath? Where did he get it from? Well, you can say the Bible, of course, but where did he get it? Nobody knows for sure. But let me share the conjecture of where Preble may have received the Sabbath that he wrote in the article, The Hope of Israel, also printed in that little pamphlet, and eventually converts the Sabbath, that pamphlet converts Joseph Bates. Where did he get it? Well, we can only guess, and this is the conjecture, that some way Frederick Wheeler, as he is studying the Sabbath after getting it earlier in 1844, he is at some workers' meeting, some preachers' meeting, circuit riding, somewhere he may have bumped into Preble. The area is not that far apart where they were moving around, and he may have shared it with Preble. And Preble then writes the article in The Hope of Israel and writes the pamphlet. Now, why do I say that, and why am I willing to accept this conjecture? Well, just look at it on the face of it, because there's no evidence that that's exactly what happened. But if you want to know more about a topic and you have read an article in a paper, who would you contact? The author. Now, if Bates contacted Preble, probably what Preble said was, well, the person who I got it from, was Frederick Wheeler, because we have absolutely no record that Bates came up here to talk to Preble. But we do have a record that he came up and talked to Frederick Wheeler. So I accept what Adventist historians have conjectured, that Preble probably got it from this congregation. Washington Barnes lived over here in Upper Hillsboro, and Bates arrives there, so the story goes, about 10 o'clock at night, knocks on the door. You can imagine a sleepy-eyed Mr. Barnes or Mr. Wheeler, whichever one, coming to the door to see what in the world is the commotion at 10 o'clock at night, way out here in nowhere land, you know. And here's bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Joseph Bates. He's all ready to study. And what's he want to study? He wants to study the Sabbath. So they study the rest of the night. According to the story, study the rest of the night. The next day they come over here to the Cyrus Farnsworth house, and Cyrus joins them, and maybe a few others join them, and they study the Sabbath some more. And now Bates is even more convinced about the Seventh-day Sabbath. So this is the full circle now of that story. Part of it you see down there, part of it you see up here. Rachel Oakes, the Seventh-day Baptist, shares it with her pastor, who shares it with another pastor, who writes an article. It goes to Bates. Eventually, in another form, it goes to J. N. Andrews, and the Sabbath is now circling the globe. It's like dropping a pebble in a pond or puddle of water, whatever. And that place where it dropped apparently was right here in this little church. This is the birthplace of the Sabbath message among Seventh-day Adventists.
Convinced about the Sabbath, Joseph Bates now had a truth in hand to share. Important days were ahead in the journey of this pioneer, who would, even without financial resources, be led by God to share the truth of the Bible Sabbath with many people. Inspired by his Bible study with Frederick Wheeler, Joseph Bates returns to his home in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, ready to share.
A couple of stories that happened in this area. After he becomes a Sabbath keeper, he decides to travel up to Washington, New Hampshire, and after he's been up there and studied the Sabbath, he comes back down to New Bedford. He's probably walked the entire way or hitchhiked with a farmer or someone, because by this time he has no money. He's given it all away in proclaiming the second coming of Christ. So he's probably walked most of the way up to New Hampshire. That would be very typical of Bates. But he comes down to New Bedford. He's coming across the old bridge. Now, what's left of the old bridge is this bit of rockway right here with some pavement on top. That was the old bridge approach in Bates's time. Anyway, he's coming across the old bridge when he meets a friend of his, James Madison Monroe Hall, named for President James Madison and James Monroe. So James Madison Monroe Hall is somewhere on the bridge approach. He knew everybody, these were small communities, everybody knew everybody, and so he knew that Bates had been away, so he hails Captain Bates and says, "Captain Bates, what's the news?" Now you've got to remember that there was no CNN or any kind of instant news in those days, and most of the news was printed in weekly newspapers, and it was often weeks old before it would get in your press, because the big presses in the big cities, they would hear the news first, and then it would kind of trickle down. And this paper would exchange with that paper, and eventually the news would get out to your paper, and each time it's been synthesized, so who knows how accurate it is. So anyway, if somebody's been traveling, the first thing you want to know is there any news? Have you heard something on this trip? And I think Hall was very surprised when Bates said, yes, the news is that the seventh day is the Sabbath. And he gives Hall a Bible study. And we're told that within a week, Bates had his first convert to the Sabbath, and the following week, Mrs. Hall accepts the Sabbath. So within about a week or two of his coming back down here, having confirmed the Sabbath truth for himself, Bates has his first two converts to the Sabbath. And I should tell you, they both stuck. Their obituaries both appear in the Review many years later. So both Halls stuck. Within another week or so, he had two more converts. I only have a picture of one of them, and this is Heman Gurney. So Heman Gurney then becomes a convert also. So now Bates has another convert, and Heman Gurney sticks with the truth. And then, as I mentioned, there's another fellow, and he also sticks with the truth. So the first four converts that Bates has to the Sabbath remained lifelong Sabbath keepers. I can't say he kept that percentage the rest of his life with everybody he converted, but at least in the beginning, the first four all remained Sabbath keepers. So that story that you've heard about happened right here, somewhere on the old bridge, this bridge approach, somewhere between here and across the Acushnet River to New Bedford. Uriah Smith actually accepted the Sabbath here in this church in December of 1852. So there's another tie-in to this historic building.
The Washington, New Hampshire church provides a great illustration of how God works with his people over time. The following are stories of how God's grace reaches out to us even when we are on the wrong path.
J.N. Andrews came up here to visit one time. He impacted one of the Farnsworth boys, Eugene Farnsworth, who was number 9 of the 22, excuse me. And here is how Eugene Farnsworth would tell about his interaction with J.N. Andrews many, many years later. He says, I want to tell you a little interesting experience about the first time, as I recollect, that Sister White was ever there at Washington. And then he talks about that. And then he says, after a while, Elder Andrews came to our place, held a few meetings, and went away. A little later, he came back with Brother and Sister White. I want to show you the wisdom that Brother Andrews had. It always impressed me. When I was a younger man, Eugene says, I had a great ambition to be a lawyer. I never thought I was going to be a preacher. He turned out to be a conference president, evangelist, and all. I never thought I was going to be a preacher. In fact, I didn't think I was going to be a preacher until over in the state of Iowa. They put a license into my hands and told me I must go out and preach. When Elder Andrews came, I was out in the field hoeing corn. I looked up and saw him coming. I was rather timid in those days, and I never got near enough to a preacher to let him speak to me. When one came to the house, I found my place out in the barn among the cattle and sheep. As Elder Andrews came toward me, he took a hoe off the gate near where I was working, we might say fence. And I said to myself, what in the world will that fella do now? He came along and began to hoe corn. Boy that I was, I could see that he didn't know anything about hoeing corn. I don't believe that he'd ever done anything like that. But finally he gets to where Eugene is, and here comes the point of the story. He says to Eugene, when he gets to the other end of the row, Elder Andrews says, Eugene, what's your purpose in life? Eugene would later recall, I liked his frank way of speaking, and I said, Elder Andrews, I'm going to be a lawyer. Well, sir, he said, you might do a great deal worse. Now, Eugene says, I want you to think of the wisdom of that reply. If he had said something directly against my plans, my opposition would have been up. But he continued, what are you going to do before you're a lawyer? Well, I said, I'm going to school. By the way, he had only had a few years of education himself, Eugene. So he's going to go to school. I'm going to school until I get an education, he responded. Well, what will you do then? I'm going to study law. Yes? And what next? Elder Andrews asked. Well, I said, I hope I'll practice. And what next? I hope to earn some money and get a competency, get a home, and have a family. Yes. And what next? Oh, I began to grow nervous. I didn't like the way he was crowding me into the corner, for I saw that he was. He said, what next? Well, Eugene responded, I suppose I shall grow old like everybody else. He said, what next? Well, I suppose I shall die. And again he said, what next? Eugene summarized his telling of the story. I tell you, that great good man had driven me to the end of my chain. Those words stuck in my memory. Then with his great blue eyes looking straight through me, he said, my boy, you take hold of something that will land your feet safely on the other side, where you will be safe for eternity. And Eugene Farnsworth summarized his story by saying, I have honored Elder Andrews all the days of my life. The people in this church were very real people, just like we are. And a descendant of Cyrus Farnsworth, who's now deceased himself, he sent me this several years ago, back in 1988 actually, some family history stories. And so I'm just going to read a couple of these. The first one has to do with William Farnsworth, who I've already mentioned had 22 children. One night, he woke up, in the middle of the night, he woke up his son, Eugene, according to this cousin of Eugene. Woke up Eugene in the middle of the night and said to Eugene, get up. Mother's having a baby. It's actually the stepmother by this point. Mother's having a baby. You need to go to Marlow to get the doctor. Well, Eugene did not want to get up. He had no interest in getting up. And he told his father he didn't want to go. Father said, why? Why won't you go? Mother's about to have a baby. He replied, well, there are already too many children in this family. And William Farnsworth quoted scripture to his son. Remember, son, it says, increase and multiply and replenish the earth. To which by this time Eugene was wide awake, and he responded, yes, but he did not tell you to do it all by yourself. Frederick Wheeler had been called west to get away from here, hovering over this little congregation. After he left, this congregation having been used to having its own pastor, began to flounder a bit spiritually. In fact, it seems that it got to the place where they weren't having any more services. And word got around to James and Ellen White and Jan Andrews about the situation in Washington, New Hampshire, and other places. And so they decided to come here, and they made a visit Christmas week. Now, how did they know there was going to be a meeting in those days if they're not holding any meetings anymore? Well, apparently some of the people still subscribed to the Review. And James White and the other ministers back in those days used to write on the back of the Review, the last page, they would put announcements. We are going to be in such and such a place on such and such a date to hold a meeting. And then we'll be in such and such a place on such and such a date to hold another meeting the week later or whatever. Jan Andrews once said that if there is any one thing that God does not know about the future, it's where James White's really going to be on any given Sabbath. He might post it back there, but he didn't always make his appointments. Anyway, they'd posted these announcements that they were going to be here at Christmas week. So they came, and they held a meeting. Now, did they hold the meeting in the church, or did they hold a meeting in the home of Cyrus Farnsworth? Well, I think the better evidence is they held the meeting over in Cyrus Farnsworth, but some say here, and I like to tell the story as though it's here because it works better for me. So I'm telling you the honest truth. I think the better evidence is it was over in Cyrus Farnsworth's house, but some accounts have it here, and it does make for a better story. So during this meeting on Monday morning, Christmas week, Ellen White did something that we do not have a record of her doing in very many other places. She did a few other places, but she stood up under the Spirit of God, and she began to look around this congregation, pointing out the sins and the challenges and the mistakes of various people in this congregation. Now, I don't know how you would feel sitting in a meeting like that. I can tell you that probably the longer it went, the more I would be sitting lower in my seat. I mean, let's face it. You know, we have stories of some of the old camp meetings where they knew, the ministers knew Ellen White was going to be there. And they would, according to some of the accounts, they would approach those meetings with a bit of fear and trepidation because nobody knew if God had shown Ellen White something about them. And if she walked into this room right today and had not been shown anything about us, she'd know nothing more about us than anybody else. But if God had shown her something, well, then obviously she did. And so what she would do is she would either ask the conference president to come and be present while she talked with the minister, or she would get her son to come. And if the wife was there, she preferred having the spouse there when she was reading a testimony to a pastor. So now picture what's going on here, or over there, but here. So she's pointing various ones. Some of them she's encouraging, saying, you know, you have been accused of doing such and such. But the Lord has shown me that's not what really happened. And so some were feeling very vindicated. Others were having their sins and mistakes pointed out and changes that they needed to make in their life to bring them into harmony with God's will for them. And this meeting goes on for about 4 or 5 hours. Now, somewhere in the course of this meeting, Eugene Farnsworth, here he is, young Eugene Farnsworth, who has given his heart to the Lord, but he has not yet decided whether Ellen White was really genuine. He thinks to himself, if Sister White, if Mrs. White is genuine, she will rebuke my father, William Farnsworth. Because Eugene knew that William Farnsworth had started chewing tobacco again. He had promised to give it up, but Eugene had been working out in the woods with his father. He'd seen a few places where his father had chewed just a little bit of tobacco and was working ahead of his son, spit in the snow, tried to cover it with his boot, and though William thought nobody knew, Eugene knew. So Eugene thought to himself, if she is what she claims to be, she's going to rebuke my father. And as he would later recount what happened, almost as soon as he thought about that, Ellen White turned to William Farnsworth and said, I have been shown that you are still using tobacco. And she probably turned to where he sat. And unfortunately, you're only sitting in half the seat. But this is where William Farnsworth used to sit, right here. So she turned to him and said, if it was here in the church, that's why I like to tell it here, because I can point to a place. You are using tobacco. And you seem to think that nobody knows, but people do.
The teenager Eugene listened attentively to the series of meetings in the days that followed, and together with 17 other children and teenagers, he gave his life to Christ. It was winter. The waters of Millen Pond were frozen, but many of those fervent young people couldn't wait. They cut a hole in the ice and were baptized in the midst of the icy waters. Of the 18 who dedicated themselves to Jesus during those meetings, 9 would go on to be workers in the church. For Eugene, the dream of becoming a lawyer was replaced with a dream of serving God. And that young man would become a pastor and later a conference president.
Now, what do you think went through Eugene's mind as a teenager at that time? The spirit of prophecy really isn't relevant. I can't trust it. It's not accurate. What do you think went through his mind? No, as a teenager, right at that occasion, he decided the gift was for real. Why? Because he had put it to the test and he knew himself that there was no way. She knew she'd just arrived in town or in the village. There was no way she could know. He knew that. And for the rest of his life, Eugene, later elder Eugene Farnsworth, was an extremely strong promoter of the writings of Ellen White. Why? Again, because as a teenager, here in Washington, New Hampshire, he had tested the gift and found it was reliable.
Wow, what an incredible story. As I reflect on this story, it causes me to ask, are there areas in my life that are unsurrendered to God? What unintended casualties may my own hard-hearted sinning be having in the lives of those around me? Sometimes we think that no one notices, but they do. The indulgence and justification of sin in the Washington, New Hampshire church had, like a cancer, destroyed the spiritual life of the church, and the kids were among the casualties. While intellectually, we may realize that God knows everything, it's often easy to forget. The way that God used Ellen White is a sobering reminder that nothing is hidden from God. It also shows us how much God loves us and acts to save the whole congregation from the spiritual death that sin brings.